Why do some of our photographs fail? Well, there's a question we could probably write a book about, but if we were to look at the cause in a worst cause first basis, we're very likely going to start with exposure. I can't think of anything more fundamental to photographers than exposure, even in the digital age. Making sure that we capture the best exposure we can as we press that shutter button is still the holy grail of photography. You'll notice I said capture the best exposure we can rather than the perfect exposure. In fact, there's no such thing as the perfect exposure. Every exposure we make is going to be a compromise, being right for some parts of the image but not others. It's rarely perfect, and that's why image editing has been around for many years. It allows us to balance up our exposures to improve our images. Some people say that shooting raw images and using the power of Photoshop and Lightroom means we don't have to be quite so precise with exposure anymore. I've also heard photographers say that they deliberately underexpose their images just a bit to avoid burnt out highlights. Well, the cars we drive have better brakes these days and airbags to protect us, but that doesn't cause us to drive faster or closer to the vehicle in front. Well, not for most of us anyway. Shooting raw can help a lot if the exposure we've made is not quite the best we could have achieved. But it's a dangerous assumption to make that close enough is good enough, especially if you're trying to maximize the quality, impact, and appeal of your own photography. If your exposure technique is a little bit on the sloppy side because you feel Photoshop or Lightroom will always come to your rescue, then it's very easy to stray just a little further off course to where the exposure really does become a problem. It can become a problem for your image quality and a problem for you and your image editing. You're going to be fighting an uphill battle with many of the manipulations you need to make. You're going to have to push those sliders in Photoshop and Lightroom much further than they really want to go, which means that at times you can fix one problem and create two others. It's worth considering that if Photoshop can help us to rescue a less than perfectly exposed image, and let's be honest, it can at times, just think what the software may be able to do with a better exposure to start with. There's another issue here too that you might want to consider. While you're battling your image editor to put right exposure errors, any creative photographic thoughts you may have had are going to be well subdued and swamped by the effort needed just to fix the exposure. We're going to be using all of our mental resources just to get a half-decent result. Another indirect effect of poor exposure is that our image editing can get so frustrating and difficult that it directly affects our ability to learn and enjoy the software that we're using. I've met many photographers who throw their hands in the air because they believe they will never grasp image editing at all. Well, of course they will, but they're not going to do so by trying to improve an image that's already beyond redemption. So what is the solution? Well, it's to identify where the exposure problem lies and what's causing it. Then we can set about learning what it is we need to do to put matters right. I think a lot of amateur photographers seem to have a love-hate relationship with their hobby because their success is rather a hit-and-miss affair. Their photography lacks consistency, which is not only tedious and frustrating, but it's also unnecessary. Generally speaking, a professional photographer cannot afford the same hit-and-miss approach. If they turn up for a paying job, they have to deliver images in any circumstances they find themselves in. Now this is good news for us amateurs because if they can do it, so can we. The real difficulty with photography and image editing is that so many areas of it are linked together, so that it's sometimes hard for us to deal with one issue without straying into other areas, which then can overwhelm us a little bit and reduce our ability to take in the information and retain it. Let me give a few observations on what photographers need to know in relation to exposure. Firstly, photographers have to learn where and when their camera's exposure meter can be trusted and when it can't, in what situations they're going to need to step in and take over control, and why they need to do that. Photographers should have a broad idea of how the exposure meter in their camera is calibrated and how that affects the images they capture, because it certainly does. Now, we're not talking here about the technical nerd stuff, very far from it, in fact. It's quite important to broadly know how the light meter in our camera is measuring the light, so we have the ability to make this judgment call. I'm constantly surprised how many quite experienced amateurs are unaware of this. It's not difficult to grasp, and it's pretty fundamental to our success. Photographers also need to understand how high contrast affects what their camera is able to capture. It's much lower than what we can see with our own eyes. Now, it's okay here to mention excessive or high contrast, but where is the line that defines high contrast? That's the question, isn't it? As I've already said, the contrast boundary can be much lower than many photographers appreciate, which is another reason why some photographs can fail. How many times does your scene look great through the viewfinder, but then appear disappointing when you view the thumbnails on your computer sometime later? Practically every photographer I've ever spoken to has experienced this, and the simple answer is that it's the gap between the contrast that you can see with your own eyes and the contrast your camera is able to capture. They are not equal. The other thing that many photographers need to break away from is the idea that capturing an image that looks great as a thumbnail on the LCD screen on the back of their camera is the way to go. The vast majority of the time, it certainly isn't. In fact, I would say that the best completed images, once they've been manipulated well, often look pretty dire on the LCD screen on the back of the camera. So there's another skill we need to learn. So one of the reasons that exposure goes wrong, as we mentioned previously, is that the photographer is relying solely on the sophistication of the camera to deal with all exposure situations. Now, while our camera can cope with most, it cannot deal with all conditions because it's just a dumb machine. And you may be attributing to your camera a much greater ability for exposure than it actually has. Another reason exposure can be tricky to learn is what I call the scattergun principle, which some photographers use. Shoot enough images, and given enough time, anyone can come up with a portfolio of 20 great images. Now, many amateurs seem to accept this scattergun hit-and-miss approach as the price they have to pay to produce good images, but it doesn't have to be that way. Automatic settings on our camera, such as program, aperture priority and shutter priority, are great in the hands of someone who understands exposure, but for those trying to learn, those settings are holding you back. Switching to manual metering will slow your picture taking down just a little bit, but you will then start to learn about exposure, and when we're learning, slowing down a little bit isn't such a bad thing. Where do we start to get on top of exposure? Well, perhaps with a little demonstration coming up in the next video. We must be able to recognize situations where the camera is about to lead us astray, But to do that, we have to raise our exposure knowledge and awareness. So let's look first at how exposure works from the camera's point of view. When we start talking about the automatic exposure settings on our camera and the benefits of switching to manual, perhaps I can offer an analogy here. If I want to go out somewhere and visit a place I've never been before, I set my sat-nav to do that. The sat-nav is an automatic setting which is going to take me from A to B. Now there's no problem with doing that at all, but 2 weeks later, when I need to go to the same place again, I need to use the sat-nav again because I didn't really pay attention to where I was going before. I relied on the automatics. It's exactly the same with our camera between aperture priority, shutter priority, program and manual. Switching to manual and you'll learn heaps. Now please forgive the very unelegant picture I've just put on the screen, but while recording this particular section, I picked up my camera, I walked outside the front door of my house, I set the camera to a manual setting, and without taking any camera light readings at all, I set 250th of a second at f8 using 100 ISO. I raised the camera to my eye, I just focused it and fired. And this is the result, pretty near perfect. Now my intention is not to brag about my exposure skills here. It's to try to indicate that exposure isn't the big mystery that many people believe it is. And if we can just raise our knowledge in this particular area, everything else starts to get easier.